All right, hello again and welcome to part one of my chapter 5 lecture. And we're going to be looking at loops. Here I have a little form with a button on it called loop. Doesn't do a whole lot, but if we go and look at the code, I have three types of loops in here. Find it, there we go. All right, there's my button one click event, which I put it in here before I renamed it. Obviously, that's not what you should do. This is called a pretest while loop. Now, pretest means that the logical test to see if this is going to continue looping or not happens at the top or before you go into the loop. So hence the name pretest. Logical test happens here, before. All right, so that's just a pretest loop. Now, a post-test loop happens at the end, and we'll look at an example of that in a minute. But anyway, so the key word is while, your comparison. I have an integer here, I, so set to 0. Now, for while loops, whether they be pre-test or post-test, if you're using a loop control variable like a counter, meaning that that's what is tested up here and controls the loop, you're going to have to increment it or decrement it some amount. Now, as I've talked to you before, this is a unary operator. I could have used shortcut like this, plus equals 1, or I could have written it like this, I equals I plus 1. That all is the same, exactly. I like to use the unaries because it's if you're just adding 1. Now, if you're adding some other number, you're going to have to use one of these. And it can be any integer or any double or float, whatever. I mean, it could be, you could add 2.73 every time it loops. Now here I'm starting at 0 and checking and going up. I could have started at a higher number and decremented this by 1 or some number like so. It just depends on what you want to do. You're capable of doing it either way. So here's a while loop. This is a pretest while loop, and we'll run this one in a minute. Now down here I have what's called a post-test do while loop. The key here is that you have to change this counter so that at some point this becomes false. If you leave this out or some way that the condition becomes false, you'll get an infinite loop. All right, so in a while loop, you have to do that. You have to yourself control the loop control variable. This is a post-test while loop. In other words, it starts off with a do, and then the while test is down here at the bottom, post, meaning later, after. The seminal difference between these two is not the fact that one's testing at the top, one's testing at the bottom. I mean, that is a difference, but that's not the seminal difference. The seminal difference is this loop may never execute. If I is 10, this is false, and it never goes into the loop. So it may or it may not execute. It all depends on this condition. And the reason is it's tested before the loop is ever entered the first time. All right? With a post test, it will always go into the body of the loop at least once. Because it doesn't matter what I is, or the loop control variable here, which happens to be I, it could be anything. It could be 1 gazillion. It doesn't matter. It's going to see this do and go right inside these brackets at least once. Then it's going to see that. It'll be false, and out it goes. So if you see that question, that's what they're talking about. Okay, now a loop obviously has to be contained within opening and closing curly braces because it's a group of code associated with this structure. Right? Now, if you've just got one statement, you might be able to get away with it, but it's not a good idea. You got to have these opening and closing braces. Now, we're going to talk about the third type of loop, which is a for loop. The neat thing about a for loop is once you set up the header here, you never have to increment or do anything in here because it happens right here. There again, that's my unary operator. I could have written it I plus equals 1 or I minus equals 1 or I equals I plus 1 or I equals I minus 1, depending on which way you're going. Here, now, actually, I could have just, since I declared this I outside of here, I could have just written it like this. Reinitialized it back to 0, which I had to do up here because it is 5 when it gets out of this loop. So that one would go in one time and blow out. So remember that you have to do that. If I wanted to access I at some point outside of this code block, which is delineated by the opening and closing curly braces, I would have to declare it outside. Now, if I wanted to do that, I could just do this. I wouldn't need that first part of this header because it's out here. I'm using it and it's visible to this code. But just for talking purposes, I'm going to put it back in. If I declare it inside here with like this, then that is a different I than the one out here. You remember we talked about scope and lifetime of variables. But once this ends, I won't be able to see it outside of this block because it only exists while this is running. So I'm going to take this off and we're just going to use the one that was declared inside this procedure. So the for loop header consists of 3 parts. This is the first, then you have a semicolon. This is the condition, then you have a semicolon. This is the control variable increment or decrement. What happens is this happens first and only once when this loop begins. It never comes back to this initialization. Then it looks here. So that's step 1. Here's step 2. Is I less than 5? Yes, it is because I just initialized it to 0. That means this is true and it goes in here and does whatever's inside. Now, I've just got some code for example in here. Whatever you have in there, it would run. Then once it finishes there, hits the last, the closing curly brace, comes back up here and increments I. Okay, so from now on, it's going to do this and then that. It won't do this anymore. All right, so it comes in here, does whatever, comes back up here, increments I, then tests. And if it's true, it comes in here, comes back up here, increments I, and then it tests. So I will start out at 0. Excuse me. It will be incremented by 1. It becomes 1. Is 1 less than 5? Yes, it is. True. Comes back inside. Increments again. Now I has a value of 2. Is 2 less than 5? Yes, it is. Goes back inside. So that was true. Increments I again. I is now 3. Is I less than 5? 3 is less than 5. It is true. Comes back in, increments once more to 4. Is 4 less than 5? It is. Comes back in here. Comes back over. It runs everything inside. That's true. Increments I by 1 again. Now I is equal to 5 or has a value of 5. Is 5 less than 5? No, that's false. The loop terminates. Okay. So I'm going to run these for you. Let's see what we have. Assuming my computer does not freeze again, which it has a propensity to do. I've lost a couple of videos like this. I was able to recover them from the temp directory because Windows just hosed on me. Let's see what it does now. Running. Okay, here we go. Click my loop button. See, I've got these message boxes in here. So as I is equal to 0, right? Now I is equal to 1. I is equal to 2, 3, 4. Now what happened? I was equal to 5. And it came out of here and then hit this one. I reinitialized it to 0. This is a post test. I is equal to 0. That's true. Increments it by 1 here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Blows out of that. Comes down here. Reinitializes it to 0. Now I have some code in here that's going to do something kind of weird. If I is equal to 2, there's a break statement you can use in these loops. It just breaks out if certain conditions are met. In other words, if I'm going from 1 to 10,000 and I'm looking for a value and I find that value after I've looped 3 times, there's no sense in continuing this loop for 9,997 more loops because I found what I need. That's just a waste of processing time. So I can exit that loop and I've got a conditional statement. If I is equal to 2, break out of this outermost loop. It does. Now, if you have nested loops, it only breaks out of the innermost. You'd have to have another one out there. So I is equal to 0. I is equal to 1. When I hit 2, bam, out it went. Okay. So there are your 3 types of loops. And this is a primer for most of you. So this is the end of part 1.